want to make sure you can hear me because I can't talk to you without a microphone. Is it working? Are we okay? That's good.
Louder.
Okay. I usually start conversations. Yeah, I usually start conversations about Gerald Chapman people with this question. Who was Gerald Chapman? And my short answer is that he was a New York City gangster captured near my home in Muncie, Indiana. I live about a mile and a half north of where Chapman was captured. Uh-oh. Feedback here. I don't remember the first time I heard the story of Gerald Chapman. It must have been nearly 70 years ago. I don't know why I remember the story, because it's been forgotten by most people. I do remember where I first heard about Chapman. About 6 miles east of Muncie in the small town of Selma, where I grew up. At family reunions in Selma, my uncles would talk about the 1920s. So I heard a story about 3 gangsters. Gerald Chapman, Dutch Anderson, and a Delaware County bad guy named Charlie One-Armed Wolf. In April 1924, Chapman and Anderson were wanted as prison escapees from the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. They were looking for a hideout. They had stolen a Lincoln Phaeton in Steubenville, Ohio, and headed west. Within a few days, they were in Eaton, just 11 miles north of Muncie. They had come from Angola, Indiana, where they had stolen a Ford owned by a man named Waldo Miller. They came to the farm of Ben and Mary Hance and rented rooms between April and August 1924. Ben Hance claimed that the man he knew was Tom Miller, not Gerald Chapman. At that time, Charlie Wolf was living in a cabin on the farm. In 1924, he was considered a friend of the Hanses. About 9 months later, January 18th, 1925, Chapman was captured in Muncie. At the time of his arrest, he was not only wanted as a prison escapee, but as a murder suspect. He was accused of shooting and fatally wounding policeman James Skelly in New Britain, Connecticut, October 12, 1924. Chapman's captors were Captain Fred Puckett, Detective Harry Brown, Detective Samuel Goodpaster, and Patrolman Mervyn Collins. Ironically, 4 police officers in a relatively small community were responsible for capturing the sophisticated criminal. A man who had avoided federal agents, post office detectives, and big city police for almost 2 years. Details about why Chapman was in Muncie and how his capture was accomplished were not published in Muncie papers. Chapman was spotted coming out of the home of Muncie doctor Harry Spickerman, then followed for several minutes and 5 blocks before he was approached by Puckett. Even though there is a detailed description of the capture published January 19th, Dr. Spickerman's name was omitted. In March 1925, Hance went to Hartford, Connecticut to testify at Chapman's murder trial. At the trial, he testified that Spickerman visited the farm several times while Chapman and Anderson were there. Chapman blamed his arrest on Ben Hance. On On April 4th, 1925, Chapman was convicted of the murder of Officer Skelly. After the guilty verdict, Dutch Anderson began harassing and threatening trial witnesses. Ben Hance's wife, Mary, feared for her life and would not testify at Chapman's trial. Ben also felt threatened, but was certain that Captain Puckett would protect him. Dutch Anderson and Charlie Wolf ambushed and killed Ben Hance and his wife Mary on August 14, 1925. The common story was that Ben had provided information to the police in 1924 that enabled Puckett to track and eventually arrest Chapman. Hance was allegedly the key to the investigation that resulted in Chapman's capture, but there were never any details released about what this information was or when Puckett received it. Charlie Wolf's motive for the murder was never clearly defined, but he had allegedly joined forces with Chapman and Anderson during 1924. Wolf was arrested the day of the Hance killings, was tried and convicted in November 1925. He was sentenced to life in prison, but his sentence was commuted. He was paroled in 1943 after he had served 18 years. Dutch Anderson wasn't caught. He was killed in a gunfight in Michigan on October 31st, 1925. The policeman that attempted to arrest him, Detective Charles Hammond, was also killed in the confrontation. After a year of appeals and legal wrangling, Chapman was executed on April 6, 1926. At the request of a friend of mine in Hartford City, I began detailed research on Charlie Wolf in 2014. I was asked to see if the book, The Count of Gramercy Park, written in 1952, accurately portrayed Charlie's association with Chapman and Anderson. The book's author, Robert Hayden Alcorn, was the son of Hugh Alcorn, prosecutor in Chapman's murder trial in 1925. The book is interesting and well written, but isn't historically accurate. I read other biographies of Chapman and found a lot of fiction posing as fact, so I decided to write my own book focused primarily on historical accuracy. I decided the best way to organize information was to develop a detailed chronology. His family name was George Charteris. He didn't start using the name Gerald Chapman until 1911. Chapman was once asked about his family and stated that it was a good family, but he had a difficult childhood in the tenements of New York City. His mother died in 1892, and his father died in 1898. He had an older sister and an older brother, but his family was fragmented by 1900. He and his brother were living with their aunt, Catherine Charteris, and her husband, John Connors, but his sister was living with cousins. He was involved with crime at an early age and was first arrested in 1902. His crimes before 1919 were all very similar. He was breaking into homes or apartments and stealing anything of value, anything that he could carry out. If it wasn't cash or coins, it was something he could later pawn, usually jewelry. His most serious crime, prior to the murder of Officer Skelly, occurred on October 28, 1911, when he was arrested for robbery. He attacked his arresting officer while attempting to escape. In January of 1912, he was given a 10-year sentence, but was released in March 1919 after serving 7 years of his 10-year sentence. Chapman was transferred from Dannemora Prison in Clinton County, New York, to Auburn Prison on December 28, 1960. Anderson was sent to Auburn April 25, 1970. When released from Auburn Prison in March 1990, Gerald Chapman had not seen the light of day as a free man since October 1911, and Dutch Anderson had been in prison continuously since December 1914. In 2017, I ran across this article in a Boston paper. It opened a completely new area of investigation and led to the conclusion that Chapman and Anderson were linked to a major criminal organization in Ohio.
Most biographies of Gerald Chapman contend that he and Dutch Anderson spent 2 years in Auburn prison planning their future criminal exploits. What they planned has never been clearly defined. Anderson was released on March 13, 1919, and Chapman was released on March 20th. Both were technically on parole, but within a few months they disappeared into the criminal underworld. When released, Anderson faced indictment on charges of theft and fraudulent use of money orders in Buffalo, New York. These crimes occurred in late 1912 and early 1913. He pled guilty and received a 4-month sentence in the Monroe County Jail in Rochester, New York. Chapman's whereabouts during this 4-month period are not documented. It is likely he was nearby in Niagara Falls, New York, meeting with 2 Toledo gangsters Arthur Cowboy Hill and Archie Dennison. The 3 men discussed the formation of a new criminal organization. Hill and Dennison were members of a gang from Ohio that robbed numerous banks in the eastern half of the country in 1919, 1920, and 1921. Chapman and Anderson were about to join this gang. Their primary headquarters was in Toledo, but were forced to move to Lima in 1921. Most gang members were ex-convicts from Ohio and New York prisons. Chapman and Hill were in Auburn Prison in New York in 1910 and 1911. The genesis of this gang was a group of thieves originally led by a very rough character from the Ohio River City, Toronto. His name was Richard Perry Howell, commonly known as Dick Howell. In February 1919, Howell was arrested in Toronto, jumped bail, and disappeared. In late 1919, Howell shot and killed Canton policeman Anthony Skotnicki. In May 1920, he was apprehended in Kentucky. In 1920, he was tried and sentenced to death and executed in 1921. In February 1919, these 4 men escaped the police raid in Toronto. Cowboy Hill and Archie Dennison went to Toledo. James Losteiner and Redden Can went to Cleveland. Anderson's release from jail was in July 1919, which coincides with a bank robbery in Buffalo, New York. Crime was attributed to the Cowboy Hill gang, although only one gang member, Orville Taylor, was positively identified as a participant. Losteiner, Chapman, Hill, and Dennison were also possibly involved. Even though they spent most of their time in the Midwest, they were in New York and Massachusetts in the summer and fall of 1919. News articles at the time of this robbery don't identify any of the participants. However, in early December 1919, some bonds stolen in this robbery turned up in Toledo. But it wasn't until 1922 that Chapman was identified as one of 4 men who participated in this robbery. To the casual observer, the Cowboy Hill gang appears to be just another group of auto bandits. But there were differences. Not only did they steal cars for resale, but they used stolen cars in robberies. They stole and switched license plates to deceive the police. They stashed cars away from crime scenes, then switched cars during a getaway to avoid detection. Women collaborators would sometimes drive getaway cars, then abandon them in cities miles away from the scene of the crime. They operated in robbery teams. They established numerous hideouts and were constantly moving between them. They diversified their activities. They posed as rich, legitimate businessmen. Instead of a boss, there was a leadership group of 9 men. 2 members of this group, Albert Johnson and Eddie Meehan, were arrested in Toledo in 1919. Late in the year, both were in the Lucas County Jail. Early on Christmas Day 1919, Albert Johnson, Eddie Meehan, Leo Mitchell, and Albert Lurch were released by 4 of their cohorts. Joe Snyder and John O'Boyle were captured because their car broke down. 4 escapees avoided roadblocks by driving across a frozen section of Lake Erie to Michigan. 4 days later, they robbed a bank. The 1920 census was conducted in January, and 2 men sharing an apartment in Toledo are recorded in that census. One was named Charles Caldwell, and the other Clarence Lafarge. Chapman used the name Caldwell in Toledo and New York, and Dutch Anderson used the name Lafarge in New York City in 1921 and 1922. The coincidence is impossible to ignore. The census of 1920 doesn't record Arthur Cowboy Hill, but other documents show that he had moved his wife and her 2 daughters out of Toledo to Norwalk. Joe Snyder and John O'Boyle, commonly known as Soldier Joe Murphy, were in jail awaiting trial for the Lucas County jail raid. Gang member John Big Turk Brennan and his wife were in Toledo in 1920. Brennan was faithful to his wife through many years of criminal activity. This fact made it possible to distinguish him from all other John Brennans. Most importantly, Chapman's girlfriend, Betty Bates, can be found in Toledo in 1920, living at 197 Cherry Street. According to Toledo police historians, this area of the city was particularly dangerous in 1920. Coincidentally, one of the gang's hideouts in the summer of 1920 was just about a half-mile from where Betty Bates lived. Chapman was staying in this apartment in September at the time it was raided by the Toledo police. Between September 3rd and September 14th, 1920, the police in Toledo were looking for Archie Dennison. He and other gang members were at a hideout in Michigan for more than a week. They fled Toledo right after a shootout with Toledo police officer Walter Cruz on September 3rd. By September 14th, 1920, several gang members had returned to the Franklin Avenue apartment. A large group of policemen armed with handguns and shotguns began surrounding the building about 9 that morning. They were looking for Archie Dennison and had been tipped off that he was in this apartment. 4 policemen went to the door. Joe Forrest answered and gave up with no resistance. Archie Dennison stepped out of one of the bedrooms and pulled his automatic. Officer Culver fired his shotgun and hit Dennison in the face. Blinded by the shot, Archie staggered into Officer Steve Quinn and wildly fired a shot into Quinn's hip. He was about to fire again when Captain James O'Reilly fired a shot into Archie's temple. Cowboy Hill ran out the back door and received so many bullet and buckshot wounds that he was reported to have been killed. He survived, but spent the rest of his life in custody. The bullets and buckshot in his body eventually caused cancer and his death at the age of 50. Chapman escaped the carnage because of a quirk of fate. He left the apartment early that morning to buy some cream for breakfast coffee. By the time he got back, he could see that the building was surrounded by policemen. He turned around and drove to Rochester, New York, only stopping for gas. The next day, he met with William J. Baker and Grace Crampton, Dutch Anderson's lawyers. Chapman left Rochester and went to another of the gang's hideouts in Detroit. A few days later, Baker and Crampton went to Detroit. Apparently, Chapman was concerned that his association with the gang would be revealed, and he would need a lawyer. Baker and Crampton met Betty Bates at that time. According to Grace Crampton, Chapman and Betty were calling themselves Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell by then. Chapman asked that Baker defend Cowboy Hill and Joe Forrest. Baker only defended Forrest unsuccessfully, and both men were sent to prison in 1921. In October 1920, Albert Johnson was killed and Jiggs Losteiner was shot and arrested. Eddie Meehan and 2 others were arrested in Wisconsin. By the end of October, the gang had lost 10 of its members, and the leadership group was reduced from 9 to 3. Chapman, Anderson, and McCann. Nevertheless, there were 3 other robberies attributed to the Cowboy Hill gang in the year 1920. One of these was in Ridgeville, Indiana, about 25 miles east of Muncie and close to the Ohio state line. Eddie Kelly was the only participant in the robbery that was caught. Eddie Kelly was arrested in Chicago in January 1921 and sent to Winchester, Indiana for trial. So, by the beginning of 1921, Chapman, Anderson, and McCann were in jeopardy in Toledo. They moved to Lima. In Lima, McCann had a robbery team: Raleigh Townsend, Joe Willis, John Mason, and George Donovan. On May 21st, 1921, these 4 men robbed the bank in Huntertown, Indiana, just north of Fort Wayne. They got away cleanly and headed east. The sheriff in Huntertown called several towns and cities in Ohio, hoping the county sheriff or police would be able to catch them. Chief Jake Roush of the Lima Police Department and his men were waiting for the car when it pulled into town. Roush and his men were aware that Red McCann and 4 others were in Lima. They had identified their hideout as a rooming house near the Halloran Hotel. Willis, Mason, and Donovan were all captured, but Townsend and McCann escaped on foot and were chased by Chief Roush. In the running gunfight, Chief Roush shot and fatally wounded Townsend. He also hit McCann twice, but tripped and fell, enabling McCann to escape. In late March or early April 1921, Chapman, Anderson, and Betty Bates went to New York City and moved into the Schuyler Arms Apartments. Chapman and Betty were Mr. and Mrs. George Vincent Caldwell, and Dutch Anderson was William Lafarge. They pretended to be rich, and they mixed with the rich. They lived lavishly in New York City. They moved from one expensive apartment or hotel to another about every 6 weeks. Chapman and Anderson supported their extravagant lifestyle by bootlegging and safecracking. In August 1921, Chapman and Anderson started meeting with Charlie Lerber, another Auburn ex-convict. They involved him in their plan to rob a mail truck, based on information and guidance provided by a former postal employee, Jeremiah Seville. Chapman, Anderson, and Lerber waylaid a mail truck on Leonard Street near Broadway. The robbery was valued at $2,400,000, but much of the value was in bonds, which required further illegal activity to convert to cash. On December 1st, 1921, Chapman, Anderson, Lerber, and an unidentified 4th man robbed employees at the American Express office in Niagara Falls, New York, of $40,000 in traveler's checks. 1922 started well, and in June, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell and Mr. Lafarge moved into an expensive apartment building in the exclusive Gramercy Park neighborhood. But reality hit on July 3rd when everybody got arrested. Betty and a friend from Arizona were questioned and released, but Chapman, Anderson, and Lerber were held for trial. The trial of Chapman and Anderson was from August 15th to August 24th, 1922. Charlie Lerber pled guilty on the first day and became the prosecution's primary witness. The guilty verdict resulted in 25-year prison sentences for both Chapman and Anderson in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Chapman's triple escape adventure started on March 27, 1923, at the Atlanta Penitentiary. Chapman and Frank Gray escaped from the prison early on the morning of March 27th. Unknown collaborators provided the 2 escapees with money, guns, and some clothing to cover their prison uniforms. They hired a taxi and managed to travel about 70 miles to a wooded area near Athens, Georgia. The next day, Chapman was shot. Gray was captured and sent back to the penitentiary, but Chapman had to be hospitalized. Chapman was placed in the St. Mary's Hospital in Athens. Doctors performed an emergency operation to remove a bullet from one of his kidneys. Soon after his operation, Chapman convinced Coralie Ramey, a gullible nurse in the Athens hospital, to send a letter to New York. This letter resulted in a visit to Athens by Dominic Deodato and Abe Silverstein on April 4th, 1923. They were sent to transport Chapman away from Athens by car. Despite his weakened condition, Chapman escaped from his hospital room on the night of April 4th. Deodato and Silverstein missed connections with Chapman, panicked, and left by train for New York City. Lacking a means of escape, Chapman hid in the basement of the hospital. He was discovered about 3 o'clock on the morning of April 6th by Nurse Estelle Scott and a guard named Harry Bishop. Chapman was hiding in a boiler room. Bishop and Nurse Scott were ushering Chapman back to his room when another nurse, Jewel Harrelson, saw them. Fearing the fugitive criminal, she became hysterical and threw her arms around Bishop's neck. This caused so much confusion that Chapman found an open door, walked out of the basement, then toward the street, and disappeared. On April 6, 1923, Red McCann was on the steamship Eagle in the Atlantic Ocean, 4 days from docking in Baltimore. Chapman had help from someone. Circumstantial evidence points to Red McCann. By May 5, 1923, Red was in New York City. He too was a highly sought fugitive and had been since May 21, 1921. Somehow, he made his way to San Francisco, where he signed on as a sailor on the steamship Eagle. In March 1923, the ship sailed south from San Francisco, through the Panama Canal, then north to New York City, arriving May 5, 1923. In the summer 1923, a private detective in Ohio found a trunk full of clothing in a hospital in Kenton. This trunk was identified as belonging to McCann. Supposedly, the person using this clothing had been in the hospital during the spring of 1923. Chapman was about the same size as McCann and could have used this clothing. The police were sure that Chapman had been in Lima during 1923 and that he had assisted McCann in a long series of robberies. Steubenville in late May, Marietta in mid-June, Steubenville again in September. Chapman was also linked to a series of bank robberies in Maine in October, which probably involved McCann. On October 29th, they robbed a department store in Wheeling, another department store on Thanksgiving Day in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, a clothing store in Lima on December 11th. A week later, Red was back in Marietta and was captured in a cafeteria where he was trapped by 3 men. He was holding a full tray of food, and while both of his hands were occupied, they pulled their guns before he could drop the tray and pull his. Dutch Anderson escaped Atlanta prison through a tunnel on December 30th with the help of 3 other prisoners. Like Chapman in April, Anderson also disappeared. Librarian Martha Gamble testified at Chapman's trial in Connecticut about a stolen library book found in Muncie. Chapman was stealing books about papermaking, inks, and printing. He and Dutch Anderson were doing research about all subjects relating to counterfeiting. Documents found in Connecticut indicated that Anderson joined the Lima Automobile Club in January 1924. So, there is evidence proving that both men were in Lima soon after Anderson escaped from prison. By April, the situation Chapman and Anderson faced was very similar to 1921. A gang member that knew where they were was about to go on trial. However, they were fugitives wanted all over the country. Based on the testimony of Catherine Bourne, given during Chapman's murder trial in 1925, we know that Chapman and Anderson went to Steubenville and stole a Lincoln Phaeton. Chapman first visited the showroom of the Stanton Company on April 5, 1924. Then again on Sunday, April 6th. With the help of John Turk Brennan, Chapman and Anderson stole the Lincoln late Sunday night or early Monday morning and headed west. They encountered bus driver William Allison on the road to Canton. Allison saw the Lincoln stalled in a ditch. He asked if they needed help, and Chapman dismissed him rudely, telling him to move on. Circumstances suggest that Chapman, Anderson, and Brennan went through Toledo, then straight west to Angola, Indiana. In Angola, they stole a Ford owned by a man named Waldo W. Miller and used the license plate from this car on the stolen Lincoln. Later, Chapman and Anderson would use the name Waldo Miller as an alias. Chapman's primary collaborator in Muncie was Dr. Harry Spickerman. The purpose and timing of this collaboration is not fully documented, but this interaction was the reason Chapman was captured. It's likely that Chapman first met Spickerman in the spring of 1920. While he and Anderson were bootleggers, they traveled extensively in the Midwest, selling whiskey and planning robberies. Dr. Spickerman had been dealing drugs as early as 1914. His main activity was the illegal distribution of morphine. In the year 1920, he was evolving into a large-scale dealer in morphine. On April 1st, 1924, Spickerman was arrested by federal narcotics agents for the illegal sale and distribution of drugs. Spickerman seems to have offered Chapman a safe haven in Muncie. In 1920, this may have been realistic. However, Spickerman's problems in 1924 created a completely different set of circumstances. Included in this complicated set of circumstances was Spickerman's family. His wife was Leela Faye Ogle. Her sister, Velma Ogle Davis, was living in the house with her husband and baby son. Faye's 2 brothers were now Delaware County officials. Van Ogle was the county prosecutor, and Guy Ogle was his deputy. Muncie newspapers systematically obscured information about the association between Spickerman and Chapman. Instead, they focused attention on Ben Hance. This wall of secrecy around the Chapman case seems to indicate that Van was somehow interfering with the investigation to protect his sister. Perhaps reluctantly, he protected Spickerman to keep his sister Faye from being targeted by Chapman and Anderson. This interference was later mentioned by Captain Puckett when interviewed in Connecticut in 1926, but he didn't mention any names. Instead, he commented on the rotten politics circumstances, Spickerman sent Chapman 11 miles north to Eaton. According to Ben Hans, Chapman and Anderson were on the farm intermittently between April and August of 1924. Ben mentioned that during this time they took several business trips. No doubt these trips were when they committed robberies. By late June 1924, Chapman and Anderson were making business trips to Springfield, Massachusetts. It was then that Walter Sheen first met with Chapman. Sheen, a sign painter in Springfield, was the son of a rich man. He had been in and out of trouble since 1921, and his father had bailed him out several times. Sheen was approached by Chapman ostensibly as a partner in the sale of whiskey. It is commonly believed that Sheen was an intended victim in some kind of extortion scheme. Chapman moved permanently out of Hans's farmhouse in August and headed east. August 30th, 1924, Chapman robbed the Sheen Dean department store in Elmira, New York, stealing many items of expensive clothing. September 4th, 1924, Chapman sent some stolen fur coats to Dr. Spickerman in Muncie. The furs were to be fenced at the Hub, a Muncie discount department store. The owners of the store rejected them because they were considered too expensive for middle-class customers. September 20th, 1924, Chapman left Anderson in Massachusetts and returned to Muncie. Late September 1924, Chapman, discovering that the fur coats were rejected by the owners of the Hub, sent them back to Sheen in Springfield in the original leather bag. The address label revealing Spickerman's location in Muncie was still on the back. September 30th, 1924, Chapman broke into the Bayless Art Store in Muncie and stole 9 rugs described as Oriental. These rugs were also sent to Walter Sheen in Massachusetts. October 5th, 1924, Chapman blew the safe at Stillman's in Muncie and escaped with $2,500. He left Muncie soon after the robbery. October 9th, 1924, Chapman arrived in Springfield, Massachusetts. October 11th, 1924, Chapman and Sheen drove from Springfield, Massachusetts to New Britain, Connecticut. Chapman checked the layout of the Davidson and Leventhal department store and prepared for a robbery. October 12th, 1924, Chapman broke into the store and attempted to open the safes. He was interrupted by 2 policemen. While escaping the department store, Chapman shot and fatally wounded Officer James Skelly. Walter Sheen was arrested near the scene of the crime and became the prime witness against Chapman. October 14th, 1924, Connecticut Detective Edward Hickey searched Walter Sheen's storeroom in Springfield, Massachusetts. He found an address label on a leather bag that contained some stolen fur coats. The address label revealed that Dr. Harry Spickerman in Muncie, Indiana, had received this bag in early September. Hickey relayed this information to Captain Fred Puckett, post office inspectors, and other law enforcement officials on October 14, 1924. Hickey asked Puckett to watch Spickerman's house. October 15, 1924, Puckett started a 2-week vacation. He drove to Kentucky. There are hints in news articles that Spickerman was investigated after Puckett returned from his vacation. Beyond this, there is no clear evidence that anyone followed up on Hickey's recommendation to shadow Spickerman. But there is a letter from Hickey to the Chief of Police, Earl Randolph, that casts doubt on the entire investigation in Muncie. In this letter, dated November 7, 1924, Hickey again requested that Spickerman be watched. This letter seems to imply Hickey believed that his prior remember he rented a garage for the purpose of hiding stolen cars. December 18, 1924, he robbed Banta's clothing store. December 21, 1924, he stole a Chrysler from the Walnut Motor Car Company, took it to Fort Wayne, then to Lima, and back to Muncie. Even though it appears that Chapman spent much of December in or around Spickerman's place, he wasn't seen until January 17, 1925. It wasn't by a policeman. The police received an anonymous tip that Chapman was seen entering Spickerman's house. January 18, 1925. After leaving Spickerman's house, Chapman walked 5 blocks before he was stopped by Puckett. At a point between W.E. Hitchcock's house and Dr. Spurgeon's house, Chapman was interrupted by Puckett, Brown, and Goodpaster in the car. This is Puckett's description of what happened as published in 1926. I stopped the car in the middle of the street, and I says to Chapman, "Mister, are you acquainted here?" He says, was walking then with the bottom button of his coat buttoned, and he had his right hand under his coat on the left-hand side. I knew his hand was on his gun. "Where does Dr. Spurgeon live?" I says to him. "I have got an awful sick man in this car, and I want to see the doctor." Well, he commenced backing away. By that time, I was out of the car, and Officer Brown was coming out of the car on the other side. I attracted his attention and was walking right to him, and he backing away. I says, "I think that he lives in this next house," and kept going at him. "You know," I says, "I can't see very good. What's that number up there, a 3 or an 8? Right then, I was figuring if he pulled the gun up from his belt, it would give me a chance to fall. If he pulled it out, I thought maybe I could get in quicker anyway. So, he pulls the gun, and just as I was about to spring at him, falling to the right, he fires. The bullet went right by me here between my arm and left side, and I springs at him, and by that time Officer Brown had hit him, and we all went down to the ground together. So, in the tussle there, we got him fastened. Fred Puckett wanted him alive. They took him alive. One shot was fired. It missed. By February, Chapman was in prison in Wethersfield, Connecticut, where he would spend the rest of his life. His trial began on March 24th, and the news coverage was intense. Every newspaper wanted to exploit Chapman's notoriety. On March 29th, 1925, the Lima Gazette published an interview with an unidentified Lima resident. The subject of the interview was Gerald Chapman, on trial for murder in Connecticut and making headline news in almost every newspaper in the country. This man was acquainted with members of the Red McGann gang in 1921 when they were in Lima. He was convinced that Gerald Chapman was not only a member of the gang, but the true leader. So, it wasn't the Cowboy Hill gang, it was the Gerald Chapman gang. If it was the Gerald Chapman gang, then Dutch Anderson was the brains of the outfit.